The alarm tore through the ship before I even understood what it meant. I was 3 decks below the royal chambers, tightening a coupling on a coolant line, when the lights above me snapped from soft blue to a pulsing red that painted the whole corridor the color of a warning I could not yet read. Every alien around me froze. Then they ran, not toward the danger, but away from it, which told me everything I needed to know about how bad this was. My name is Daniel Ashworth, and 6 months ago I was an engineer on a maintenance contract, the kind of job nobody back on Earth would call glamorous. Now I was one of maybe 40 humans living aboard the Calith Ascendant, flagship of the Vral Empire, part of the first wave of people allowed to work among a species that could crush our entire species without much effort at all. The Vral were not like us. They stood taller, moved with a strange gliding grace, and their eyes held a faint violet light that made you feel, every time they looked at you, like they were reading something written on the inside of your skull. They had built an empire that stretched across more star systems than I could count, and they had done it long before humans figured out how to leave our own solar system without dying in the attempt. We were new to them, new and small, and, in the eyes of most of the coalition species, not worth much trust. I sprinted toward the sound of the alarm, because that was simply what I did. Fix what is broken, find out what has gone wrong. It was a habit built into me long before I ever stepped onto an alien ship, and it was about to change my life. By the time I reached the upper transit ring, a crowd had already gathered outside the royal gardens, a wide dome of engineered trees and floating lights that Queen Sajara Vral kept as her private retreat. Guards in dark ceremonial armor stood shoulder to shoulder, spears crossed, refusing to let anyone near the entrance. Beyond them, through gaps in their formation, I caught flashes of movement. Healers, robes stained the color of alarm, a stretcher, and on that stretcher, still and pale beneath skin that should have glowed faintly violet like her mother's, lay Princess Ithnara. She was the only member of the royal family who had ever bothered to learn my name. I should explain who she was to me, because it matters for everything that comes after. Ithnara was young, by Vral standards, still decades from taking any real power, but she carried herself with a curiosity that set her apart from every other noble aboard that ship. Most of the Vral court treated humans the way you might treat a strange animal that had wandered into a formal dinner. They were not cruel most of the time, but they were distant, careful, unwilling to get too close to a species so recently arrived and so obviously behind them in nearly everything that mattered. Ithnara was different. She used to find reasons to walk past the maintenance bay just to ask questions. Why do humans build machines instead of growing them the way the Vral did? Why did we tell stories about monsters under our beds when we had no monsters left on our world to be afraid of? Why did I, a grown man with a respectable job, still keep a small photograph of my parents tucked inside my uniform pocket? I told her once that humans were sentimental creatures, and she had laughed, a bright, surprised sound, and said that sentiment was not a weakness at all, but the very thing her people had lost somewhere in the long climb to power. She used to sneak me extra ration credits when the human allotment ran short. She once spent an entire afternoon in the engine bay just to watch me repair a broken filtration unit, asking so many questions that my supervisor eventually gave up trying to shoo her away. She was, in the smallest and simplest sense, my friend. And now she lay on a stretcher, unmoving, while the ship above and around me seemed to hold its breath. I pushed closer, ignoring the sharp looks from the guards, until I could hear the healers speaking in low, urgent tones. Words like toxin, words like unknown compound, words like stabilized, for now, for now. Those 2 words settled into my chest like a stone. A tremor ran through the deck plating beneath my feet, subtle at first, then stronger, until the floating lights in the garden dome flickered and dimmed. I felt it before I understood it. A pressure behind my eyes, a weight pressing down on the air itself. The Queen was coming. I had seen Sajara Vral only twice before, both times from a respectful distance during formal ceremonies where humans were permitted to stand and watch, but never to speak. She was, by any measure, one of the most powerful individuals in known space, ruler of an empire that had stood for longer than human civilization had kept written records. Her presence alone could silence a room the size of a small stadium. When she arrived at the garden entrance, the crowd did not part so much as collapse away from her, guards and nobles alike pressing themselves flat against the walls, eyes lowered, bodies trembling. I had never seen fear like that directed at another living being. Not fear of violence, exactly, though that was certainly part of it. It was something closer to fear of disappointing a force of nature, the kind of dread you might feel standing before an approaching storm that had, for reasons no one understood, learned how to notice you. She knelt beside the stretcher, and for one long moment, the most powerful person on that ship simply looked like a mother. Then she rose. The transformation was immediate and total. Her violet eyes, usually calm and measured, blazed with a light so intense it was almost painful to look at directly. The air around her seemed to bend, the way heat bends light above hot pavement, and every surface within 20 feet began to hum with a low, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth. I did not yet know what I was witnessing. I only knew that every instinct in my body told me to run, and every instinct in my body was wrong, because running would only draw her attention. She turned toward the crowd, and though I could not read Vral expressions the way another Vral could, I understood perfectly what I saw on her face in that moment. It was not sorrow, it was something far more dangerous than sorrow. Her voice, when it came, was not merely a sound. It rolled through the corridor like something physical, shaking dust from the light fixtures overhead, forcing every knee within earshot to bend, whether its owner intended to kneel or not. I did not kneel. I could not have told you why, in that moment, except that some stubborn part of me refused to let fear decide what my body would do. The Queen's eyes found mine across the crowd, and for one terrible heartbeat, I thought that stubbornness had been a mistake. But her attention moved past me, sweeping across the assembled nobles, guards, and diplomats who filled the corridor. And then she spoke the words that would end up shaping everything that followed, words that I would hear repeated for the rest of my life, in 100 different languages, across 100 different worlds. Who dared to harm my daughter? The question hung in the air like a blade. Nobody answered. Nobody dared, and in that silence I understood that something terrible was about to happen, something that had nothing to do with whoever had actually hurt Ithnara, and everything to do with who the Queen's fury would land on first. I did not know it yet, but I was about to become part of that answer, whether I wanted to be or not. The healers worked quickly behind the Queen, murmuring status reports that only made her stiller and more terrible to look at. Ithnara's condition was stable, they said, but the substance in her system was unfamiliar, unlike any poison or toxin catalogued in the Empire's considerable records. That detail, more than any other, seemed to unsettle the Queen most of all. An unknown poison meant an unknown enemy, and an unknown enemy, aboard a ship this heavily guarded, this thoroughly monitored, meant someone with access, someone trusted, someone close. I glanced around the corridor at the gathered dignitaries, delegates from a dozen different empires who had come aboard the Caliph Ascendant for a diplomatic summit meant to strengthen ties between the coalition's member species. I recognized representatives from 3 rival powers among them, each one now watching the others with poorly hidden suspicion. It did not take a genius to see where this was heading. Old rivalries, old grudges, decades of careful diplomatic balance, all of it hanging by a thread in this single corridor. And somewhere in the crowd, whoever had actually poisoned the princess was almost certainly still standing among us, calm and unnoticed, waiting to see who would be blamed in their place. I thought about walking away. I told myself that this was not my fight, that I was a maintenance engineer with no standing in a royal court, no voice in matters this large, no business inserting myself into an unfolding crisis between empires. But then I looked again at that stretcher, at the small, still figure who had once spent an entire afternoon asking me why humans kept photographs of the people we loved, and I knew I was not going anywhere. The Queen's voice rolled through the corridor a second time, quieter now, but somehow more frightening for its quiet. Someone will answer for this. Before this day ends, someone will answer. I did not know yet who that someone would be. I only knew, with a cold certainty settling into my stomach, that the wrong answer was already forming in the minds of everyone around me, and that if I stayed silent, an innocent person was going to pay for a crime they had never committed. The alarm finally cut off, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. Guards began moving through the crowd, no longer standing at attention but actively searching, their spears lowered into something closer to a threatening posture. I watched as they pulled aside delegate after delegate, questioning them in low, sharp tones, dismissing most within seconds. Then I saw them stop in front of a familiar face. Peter Langley, one of the other human maintenance workers, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself and had, as far as I knew, no history with the royal family at all beyond routine repair work in the Garden Dome earlier that same day. The guards seized his arms. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, though nothing physical had moved at all. Peter had been in the gardens. Peter had access. Peter was human, new, expendable, exactly the kind of scapegoat that would let every other delegation walk away clean, exactly the kind of convenient answer that would let the Queen's fury land somewhere without threatening the fragile peace between older, more powerful empires. I understood, in that moment, that I was watching the first domino of a terrible mistake begin to fall, and that unless someone stepped forward to stop it, an innocent man was about to pay a price meant for someone else entirely. The Queen's violet eyes swept across the crowd one final time, searching for someone to answer her question. And I realized, with a feeling somewhere between terror and a strange, quiet certainty, that I was the only person aboard that ship who actually knew where to look for the truth. Peter's face had gone the color of old paper. He was not a young man, and he had a wife back on Earth who wrote him letters every week, letters he kept in a small metal box beside his bunk. I knew this because he had shown them to me once, during a long night shift, both of us too tired to sleep and too far from home not to talk about it. Now 2 Vral guards held his arms so tightly that his shoulders had begun to shake, not from resistance, but from the simple, animal terror of a man who understood he was about to be blamed for something he had not done. The crowd around us had shifted into something uglier than fear. I could feel it moving through the corridor like a current. Dozens of alien delegates from a dozen different empires, each one calculating, in their own way, how this crisis might be turned to their advantage. If the Queen's wrath fell on the humans, an entire species newly arrived and without powerful allies, then every other empire aboard that ship would walk away untouched, their reputations intact, their delegations free to return home without further scrutiny. It was, I understood with a sick clarity, the most convenient outcome for almost everyone present. Everyone except Peter. Everyone except the truth. A representative from one of the older empires, a tall being wrapped in ceremonial silks, the color of deep water, stepped forward and spoke in a smooth, practiced voice that carried easily across the silent corridor. Your Majesty, this human was seen entering the Garden Dome not 2 hours before the princess was found. Perhaps the answer to your question is already standing before you. I did not know this delegate's name, but I recognized the particular tone of someone eager to close a dangerous conversation as quickly as possible, before it could turn and look in any uncomfortable direction. Other voices rose in quiet agreement, a chorus of nobles and diplomats all suddenly very interested in seeing this matter resolved swiftly, cleanly, and far away from themselves. The Queen turned toward Peter, and I watched the violet fire in her eyes settle on him like a physical weight. Guards tightened their grip. Somewhere behind her, a healer murmured something about the princess's vital signs, a detail nobody in that corridor seemed to be listening to anymore, because the crowd had already found what it wanted. Not the truth, just an answer. Any answer, so long as it was not their own. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it would be easy, looking back, to make myself sound braver than I actually felt in that moment. I was terrified. I had no standing in that room. I was not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a member of any delegation with the authority to speak in a royal court. I was a maintenance engineer who fixed coolant lines and filtration units, a small replaceable cog in a machine so much larger than myself that the idea of stepping forward and interrupting a grieving, furious monarch felt less like courage and more like a particularly elaborate form of choosing my own ending. But I thought of Ithnara asking me why humans kept photographs of the people we loved, and I thought of Peter's letters in that small metal box, and I understood, with a clarity that cut straight through my fear, that if I said nothing, I would spend the rest of my life knowing exactly what my silence had cost. The Queen raised a hand, and I understood instinctively that whatever came next would happen very quickly, and would not be something anyone in that corridor could undo. That was when I heard my own voice, steadier than I expected, cutting through the silence. Wait. The word landed in that corridor like a stone dropped into still water. Every head turned toward me. Every eye, human and alien alike, found me standing near the edge of the crowd, my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone around me could hear it. The Queen's gaze swept across the gathered delegates and settled on me with a sudden, terrible focus, as though she had only just noticed I existed at all. Given the size of the crowd and the smallness of my place within it, that was likely true. For a long moment, nobody moved. I was acutely aware of every guard within striking distance, every spear that could close the space between us in less time than it would take me to draw another breath. I had interrupted a reigning monarch in the middle of naming a suspect for the attempted murder of her only daughter. I understood, somewhere in the calmer part of my mind that had not yet caught up to the danger, that this was very likely the last mistake I would ever make. The Queen's voice, when it came, was low and dangerously quiet, a stark contrast to the roar that had shaken the corridor only minutes before. "You dare interrupt me!" It was not phrased as a question, but I answered it as though it were one, because the alternative was silence, and silence, in that moment, would have meant Peter's life. "I do not believe this man is guilty, Your Majesty, and I do not believe you will find the truth by choosing the easiest answer instead of the correct one." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the crowd. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper the word insolence, and someone else, closer to the Queen, whisper something in the Vral tongue that I did not understand but could guess the meaning of easily enough. The Queen took a single step toward me, and the temperature in that corridor seemed to drop several degrees, though I knew that was almost certainly my own fear playing tricks on my senses. Her violet eyes studied me with an intensity that made me feel as though every thought in my head were being read aloud for the entire court to hear. "You would speak for him. On what authority?" I had no authority. I had no title, no rank, no standing that would have meant anything in that room even a day earlier. What I had, instead, was 3 months spent quietly noticing small irregularities in the ship's security logs, patterns that had bothered me enough to keep a private record of them, though I had never told anyone, because I had assumed, foolishly, that it was not my place to raise concerns about systems I had not been asked to monitor. "I have evidence, Your Majesty. Not proof yet, but evidence that points somewhere other than where your guards are looking." The words hung in the air, and I watched something shift behind the Queen's eyes, a flicker of calculation replacing pure fury, though the fury itself had not gone anywhere at all. She was, whatever else she might have been in that moment, still a ruler who had built and held an empire for longer than my own species had existed as a spacefaring people. Rulers like that did not survive by ignoring information, even information offered by the least significant person in the room. Explain yourself. And know that if you are wasting my time while my daughter lies unconscious, I will not be merciful about it. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry, and I felt every eye in that corridor settle on me with a weight I had never experienced before and hoped never to experience again. 3 weeks ago, I noticed that the automated security drones assigned to patrol the upper garden dome had begun reporting maintenance cycles that did not match their actual usage logs. It was a small discrepancy, the kind of thing most engineers would dismiss as a minor calibration error. But I checked it twice, because that is simply how I was trained to work, and the discrepancy did not go away. It got worse. The Queen's expression did not soften, but something in her posture shifted, a fractional lean forward that told me, more than any words could have, that I had her attention now in a way I had not expected to earn so quickly. Someone tampered with the drone logs in that section of the ship, recently, and whoever did it either did not know that human engineers still perform manual verification checks that the VRAL systems no longer require, or did not care, because they assumed no one would think to look. A tense silence followed, broken only by the quiet hum of the medical equipment surrounding Ithnara's stretcher. I could feel Peter watching me from where the guards still held him, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. The Queen studied me for a long moment, and I understood that everything now depended on whether she decided I was telling the truth or simply delaying an execution she had already decided upon. "Show me," she said finally, and the words carried a weight of consequence I felt settle over my entire body. "Show me this evidence, human, and show it to me now, and know that if you cannot, the mercy you have bought this man will end, along with any mercy you might have hoped for yourself." I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the small data tablet clipped to my belt, the same tablet I used every day to log routine maintenance reports, never imagining it might one day hold the difference between life and death for a man I considered a friend. As I pulled up the files, I became aware of movement at the edge of the crowd, a figure shifting position with a subtlety that would have meant nothing to anyone not specifically watching for it. I only noticed because I happened to glance up at exactly the right moment, catching sight of a Vral noble I did not recognize, dressed in the deep formal robes of the inner court, stepping backward toward the corridor's far exit with unhurried, deliberate calm. Something about that calm bothered me more than any panic could have. I filed the observation away, uncertain yet what it meant, and turned my attention back to the Queen, who waited with an expression that made it clear my next words would determine far more than Peter's fate alone. "Your Majesty," I said, steadying my voice as best I could, "I believe someone deliberately created a false trail meant to point toward an outside threat, and I believe they did it from somewhere much closer to your daughter than any of the delegates currently under suspicion." The corridor fell utterly silent. The Queen's eyes narrowed, violet light flickering with something that was no longer only grief, but a sharp, focused calculation that I recognized, in that moment, as the true source of her empire's long survival. She had not built and held power across 100 worlds through rage alone. Beneath the fury was a mind that missed very little, and that mind had just fixed itself entirely on me. "Continue," she said quietly. "And Daniel Ashworth, understand this clearly. If what you say is true, you will have done my house a service I will not forget. But if you are wrong, or if you are lying to protect your own kind at the expense of the truth, there will be nowhere in this empire far enough to hide from what follows." I swallowed hard, aware that I had just crossed a threshold I could not uncross, and that the next few minutes would decide not only Peter's fate, but quite possibly my own. Behind the Queen, one of the healers straightened suddenly, calling out that the princess's condition had shifted, her vital signs weakening rather than stabilizing, and the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath at once. Whatever poison ran through Ithnara's veins, it was not finished with her yet. And somewhere among the crowd still gathered in that corridor, the person responsible was watching everything unfold with an unhurried calm that no innocent bystander could have managed. I had bought Peter a reprieve. I had not yet bought the truth. And time, I understood with a growing dread, was no longer on our side. The healer's warning sent a fresh wave of tension through the corridor, and for a moment I thought the Queen might abandon our conversation entirely to return to her daughter's side. Instead, she turned toward the medical team with a single sharp command in the Vral tongue, and 2 more healers rushed past us carrying equipment I did not recognize, their expressions grim with the particular urgency of professionals trying not to show fear. Sajara Vral turned back to me, and whatever composure she had gathered in the last few minutes had thinned considerably. "You have my attention, human. Use it wisely, because I do not intend to give you much more of it while my daughter's condition worsens." I nodded and held up the data tablet, pulling up the logs I had saved over the past 3 weeks, records I had never expected to matter to anyone beyond my own curiosity. The drones patrolling the upper garden dome are programmed to run a full diagnostic cycle every 12 hours. I noticed the timestamps on those cycles had begun drifting, sometimes by only a few minutes, but always in the same direction, always slightly later than they should have been. On a system this advanced, that kind of drift does not happen by accident. It happens because someone is accessing the drones during a narrow window and adjusting the logs afterward to cover the gap. The Queen studied the tablet's display, her violet eyes moving across data she likely understood far better than I did, given that it was her own ship's systems I was describing. After a long moment, she looked up at me with an expression I could not fully read. Our security systems flagged none of this. I hesitated, uncertain how much honesty the moment could bear, then decided that half measures would serve no one. "With respect, Your Majesty, I do not think your systems were designed to notice this kind of tampering, because they were built by a species that has likely never needed to distrust its own technology the way humans do. We build in redundancy because our machines fail more often than yours. We check things manually because we have learned, over centuries, not to fully trust any single source of information. It is possibly the only advantage we currently have over the empires we now find ourselves among." A murmur passed through the gathered crowd, some of it skeptical, some of it grudgingly thoughtful. I noticed the tall delegate in the deep water-colored robes shifting uncomfortably, his earlier eagerness to see the matter closed replaced by something more cautious. The Queen gestured for me to continue, and I pulled up the next set of records, the ones that had troubled me most in the weeks before today. Whoever accessed those drones did so through a maintenance override code, the kind normally reserved for senior technical staff. I checked the access logs for every human engineer with that clearance level, and none of them were near the garden dome during the windows in question. Which means the override code was used by someone outside the human maintenance division entirely. "Someone with senior clearance," the Queen said slowly, her voice carrying a weight that told me she already understood the implications better than I could have explained them. "Someone with senior clearance, and someone who knew enough about your ship's systems to create a false trail pointing toward an outside threat," I confirmed. "I do not believe this was the work of a rival empire's agent smuggled aboard your ship, Your Majesty. I believe whoever did this had access that only someone from within your own court could possess." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not the frozen, fearful stillness of a crowd waiting to see who would be blamed. It was the sharper, more dangerous quiet of powerful people suddenly recalculating who among them might not be as loyal as they had assumed. The Queen's gaze swept across the assembled nobles standing near her, and I watched several of them stiffen under that attention, their composure cracking at the edges despite their obvious efforts to appear unaffected. "I noticed something else," I said, deciding that this was not the moment for half measures. "When I arrived at this corridor, I saw someone leaving through the far exit, moving in a way that struck me as deliberately unhurried. I did not recognize their face, but I recognized the deep formal robes of your inner court." The Queen turned sharply toward the exit I indicated, and I saw something pass across her features that I had not seen since this crisis began. Not fury this time, but something colder, more focused, the expression of a ruler beginning to understand that the wound to her family might run deeper than a single act of violence. "Describe this individual," she said, and her voice had dropped to something quiet and dangerous, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I did my best, describing the height, the particular cut of the robes, the unhurried pace that had struck me as so wrong in a corridor full of panic. As I spoke, I noticed several nobles exchanging glances, quick and subtle, the kind of look that passes between people who suddenly suspect they know exactly who is being described but would rather not be the one to say the name aloud. Finally, an older Vral woman standing near the healers, her robes marked with symbols I did not recognize but assumed indicated some position of authority within the medical staff, stepped forward with visible reluctance. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. That description matches Lord Vesic. The name landed in that corridor like another kind of alarm entirely. I watched the Queen's expression shift, and for the first time since I had stepped forward to interrupt her, I saw something that looked almost like disbelief cross her features, quickly suppressed, but not quite fast enough to hide entirely. Lord Vesic serves on my own council, she said, and though her voice remained level, I could hear something straining beneath the surface of it. He has served this house for 3 generations. His loyalty has never once been questioned. I understood, even as an outsider to this court, exactly why that fact troubled her so deeply. A stranger, an outside agent, a rival empire's spy, these were threats a ruler could prepare for, expect, defend against. But a trusted advisor, someone woven into the fabric of her own household for decades, someone who had likely stood beside her through countless quieter moments that never made it into any official record, that kind of betrayal cut in a way that violence from a stranger simply could not. I do not claim to know Lord Vesic's motives, Your Majesty, I said carefully. I only know what the evidence suggests, and I believe it deserves to be investigated before anyone else is punished for a crime they may not have committed. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some point beyond me, beyond the corridor entirely, as though she were working through calculations far more complicated than the simple facts I had presented. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a new authority, sharper and more decisive than the raw fury of before. "Release the human," she said, and I felt the entire corridor exhale at once as the guards holding Peter's arms stepped back, though he remained too stunned to move on his own. "Find Lord Vesic, bring him before me, and seal every exit from this section of the ship until he is found." Guards moved immediately, spreading out through the corridor with a new urgency, and I felt Peter's hand find my shoulder, gripping it hard enough that I understood, without needing words, exactly what he was trying to say. The Queen turned back to me, and for a moment, the fury and grief that had defined her since the alarm first sounded seemed to give way to something more measured, though no less intense. "You have bought this man his life, human, and you have possibly uncovered a betrayal I would not have found on my own, not soon enough to matter. I will not forget this, but do not mistake my gratitude for the matter being closed. If Lord Vesic is guilty, I intend to understand exactly why, and exactly how far this betrayal extends." I nodded, though a new unease had settled into my chest, one I could not quite name yet. Something about the calm, unhurried way Lord Vesic had left that corridor bothered me more the longer I thought about it. A guilty man caught in the act, discovered through a chain of evidence he likely believed was untraceable, should have shown some sign of panic, some flicker of fear at being seen. Instead, he had simply walked away, as though the matter were already settled in his own mind. That kind of calm did not belong to someone caught by surprise. It belonged to someone who had already planned for this exact moment, someone who had anticipated discovery and prepared accordingly. I opened my mouth to voice this concern to the Queen, but before I could speak, one of the healers cried out from beside Ithnara's stretcher, her voice cutting through the corridor with an urgency that silenced every other conversation at once. "Your Majesty, the princess is failing. We need to move her to the medical bay immediately, or we will lose her within the hour." The Queen's entire focus snapped back to her daughter, and in that instant, I watched something in her posture change, the calculating ruler giving way, if only for a moment, to something rawer and more desperate underneath. "Move her," she commanded, her voice cracking slightly around the edges in a way I suspected very few beings had ever heard from her before. The healers moved quickly, and the crowd parted to let the stretcher pass, guards forming a protective corridor as they carried Ithnara toward the medical bay at the fastest pace her fragile condition would allow. I stood frozen for a moment, watching them go, my earlier unease about Lord Vesic's calm departure still nagging at the edges of my thoughts. Something about this entire situation felt incomplete, as though we had uncovered only the visible portion of a much larger design, one that had accounted for exactly the kind of discovery I had just made. Peter's hand tightened on my shoulder again, and I turned to find him staring at me with an expression somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "I do not know how to thank you for that," he said quietly, his voice still shaking slightly from the ordeal. "Thank me later," I said, my mind already racing ahead to the uncomfortable question I could not shake. Right now, I need to figure out why a man caught red-handed in a plot against the princess would walk away so calmly, unless he already had a plan for exactly this moment. Peter's expression shifted from relief to concern as he followed my meaning, and around us, the corridor had begun to empty as guards fanned out through the ship, searching every level for Lord Vesic. I had a growing feeling, one I could not fully justify with evidence yet, that we were not chasing a man trying to escape. We were chasing a man who wanted to be found, on his own terms, at a moment of his own choosing. And somewhere aboard that ship, Ithnara's condition continued to worsen, the poison in her system still doing its slow, patient work, as though it, too, had been designed with exactly this kind of delay in mind. I followed the search parties toward the medical bay, unable to stay away, and found Peter walking beside me despite my suggestion that he take the opportunity to rest after everything he had just endured. He waved off my concern with a tired shake of his head, insisting he would not be able to sit still, knowing how close things had come to ending badly for both of us. The medical bay occupied an entire deck near the center of the ship, a hub of soft light and quiet machinery, where Vral healers worked with an efficiency that felt almost hypnotic to watch. Ithnara had been placed inside a containment chamber lined with sensors, her small form dwarfed by the equipment surrounding her, and the Queen stood beside that chamber with a stillness that seemed to require an enormous, controlled effort. I hung back near the entrance, uncertain whether I had any place in a room reserved for royalty and senior medical staff, but the Queen glanced up and gestured for me to approach, a gesture so unexpected that several of the nearby guards visibly startled. "Your instincts led us to the truth once already, human," she said quietly, without turning her eyes away from her daughter's chamber. "I find myself unwilling to dismiss them now." I stepped closer, glancing at the readouts scrolling across the chamber's display, though the alien symbols meant nothing to me. A senior healer, the same woman who had identified Lord Vesic earlier, approached with an expression I did not like at all. "Your Majesty, the compound in the princess's system is resisting our standard countermeasures. It appears to have been engineered specifically to adapt to Vral physiology in ways our medical databases have no record of." The Queen's jaw tightened, and I watched her hands curl slowly into fists at her sides. The only outward sign of the storm I suspected was raging beneath her composed exterior. "Then find a way to counter it that is not in your databases," she said, her voice low and controlled in a way that felt more frightening than any shout could have been. I hesitated, then spoke before I could talk myself out of it. "Your Majesty, if this compound was engineered specifically to resist Vral treatment protocols, then whoever created it likely tested it against those same protocols beforehand. That means somewhere there should be records of failed formulations, discarded versions that did not work as intended. If we can find those records, we might understand what this compound is built to resist, and work backward from there." The healer looked at me with new interest, some of her earlier skepticism toward a human offering medical opinions giving way to cautious consideration. "That is not an unreasonable approach," she admitted, "but it would require access to research files that, if they exist at all, would likely be hidden very carefully." "Hidden the same way someone hid tampered security logs," I said, the pieces beginning to click together in my mind with an unsettling clarity. "Your Majesty, I believe Lord Vesic's private quarters or personal research space might hold exactly the kind of records we need." The Queen turned to one of her guards, issuing a rapid command in the Vral tongue, and within moments, word came back that Lord Vesic's private chambers had been located and secured, though the man himself remained missing despite the ship-wide search. We moved together, a strange procession of Queen, guards, healers, and two very out-of-place human engineers, through corridors that grew increasingly ornate as we approached the section of the ship reserved for the highest-ranking members of the royal court. Lord Vesik's chambers occupied a suite larger than any human aboard the ship had ever been permitted to see, filled with artifacts and decorations that spoke of centuries of accumulated status and trust. Trust that had apparently meant nothing when weighed against whatever motive had driven him to poison a child he had likely known since her birth. The guards found the hidden research space behind a false wall in the chamber's private study, a discovery that sent a fresh wave of anger rippling through the Queen's expression as she surveyed the equipment inside. Vials, data terminals, notes written in a careful, precise hand that I could not read but understood, from context alone, represented months or possibly years of careful preparation. This was not a crime of sudden impulse. This was a plan built slowly, patiently, over a long stretch of time, by someone who had used his position of trust to gather exactly the knowledge and access he needed. The senior healer moved immediately to the research terminal, her hands moving quickly across controls as she began pulling up files. I watched her expression shift from concentration to something closer to horror as she read through the data appearing on the screen. "Your Majesty," she said slowly, "this compound was not designed simply to harm the princess. It was designed to weaken her specifically, in a way that would leave her alive but permanently diminished, unable to fulfill the requirements of succession under Vral law." The Queen went very still, and I understood, even without full knowledge of Vral succession customs, exactly what that meant. This had never been an assassination attempt at all, not in the way we had assumed. It had been something colder and more calculated, an attempt to remove Ithnara as an obstacle without the political consequences that an outright killing would have brought down upon whoever was responsible. "Someone wanted her out of the line of succession," I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else in the room, but the Queen's sharp gaze snapped toward me anyway. "Continue," she said, and I understood she wanted my full reasoning, not simply the conclusion. If Lord Vesik wanted power for himself, weakening the princess without killing her would draw far less attention and far less retaliation than an outright murder would have. A death demands justice, demands investigation, demands answers. A slow decline, especially one made to look like the work of an outside rival, might have simply been accepted as an unfortunate consequence of galactic politics, something to be mourned rather than avenged. The Queen's expression darkened further, and I watched the healer at the terminal pull up additional records, ones that revealed something even more troubling than what we had already discovered. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice unsteady now, "these files indicate Lord Vesik believed himself next in line for regency should the princess become unable to fulfill her duties. There are notes here referencing conversations with other council members, discussions about succession that predate the princess's injury by several months. This was not the work of one man acting alone, I realized, the full scope of the conspiracy settling over the room like a physical weight. There were others involved, or at least others aware of what Lord Vesik intended, others who had said nothing, done nothing to stop a plot that had nearly succeeded in permanently harming a child. The Queen's fury, which had cooled somewhat during our search, flared back to life with a terrible new intensity, though this time it carried none of the wild, unfocused rage from the corridor. This was something colder, more deliberate, the anger of a ruler who now understood exactly how deep the betrayal ran, and exactly what she intended to do about it. "Find him," she said, her voice carrying to every guard in the room with a weight that left no room for hesitation. "Find every name mentioned in these files, and bring them all before me." As the guards moved to comply, I felt a growing unease settle over me, the same instinct that had bothered me earlier about Lord Vesik's calm departure from the corridor. A man this careful, this patient, would not have left such damning evidence behind unless he had already planned for its discovery, unless this moment, right now, was somehow still part of whatever design he had set in motion months or years earlier. "Your Majesty," I said carefully, "I do not think Lord Vesik is trying to escape." The Queen turned toward me sharply, her patience for interruptions clearly wearing thin despite everything I had already contributed. "Explain." "Everything we have found," I said, choosing my words as carefully as I could, "was left in a place we were guided to find it. He knew his access codes could be traced. He knew someone would eventually check the drone logs, or he would not have used a method careful engineers like myself might notice. And now we have found a research space conveniently revealing a wider conspiracy, filled with names and notes that implicate other members of your council. The healer at the terminal looked up sharply, understanding dawning on her face at the same moment it settled fully into mine. "You believe this was designed to be found," the Queen said slowly, her voice carrying a new, dangerous edge. "I believe someone wanted you distracted, chasing a conspiracy of names and betrayals large enough to consume your full attention, while the real threat remains somewhere you are not currently looking," I said. "Your Majesty, where is Lord Vesic right now, at this exact moment?" The question hung in the air, and I watched the Queen's expression shift from fury to something sharper, more focused, the look of a predator suddenly aware that she might have been herself the one being hunted. A guard's comm device crackled to life at that exact moment, an urgent voice reporting a disturbance near the medical bay, the very place we had all just left Ithnara resting under careful watch. The Queen did not wait for the guard to finish speaking. She turned and moved with a speed that sent everyone else in the room scrambling to keep pace, guards and healers alike rushing after her through the ornate corridors we had only recently traveled in the opposite direction. I ran with them, my heart pounding, understanding with a sick certainty that we had all just walked directly into exactly the distraction Lord Vesic had planned for us, and that whatever waited back at the medical bay would determine, far more than anything we had discovered so far, whether Princess Ithnara would survive this day at all. We reached the medical bay to find the outer doors sealed, a small cluster of guards working frantically at the control panel, while others pounded uselessly against the reinforced barrier. Through the narrow viewing window, I caught a glimpse of movement inside, a familiar figure in deep formal robes standing beside Ithnara's containment chamber, one hand resting against the controls with an unhurried, deliberate calm that matched exactly what I had witnessed in the corridor hours before. Lord Vesic had never been running from us at all. He had been waiting for us to arrive, at exactly this moment, with exactly this audience, so that whatever he intended to do next would be witnessed by the one person whose reaction mattered most in his entire calculated design. The Queen let out a sound I had never heard from any living being before, something between a roar and a cry of pure anguish, and threw herself against the sealed door with a force that sent guards scrambling to avoid being struck. The barrier held, reinforced against exactly this kind of assault, and I understood, watching her claw uselessly at controls that refused to yield, that even the most powerful ruler in this section of the galaxy could be rendered utterly helpless by a single locked door and a patient enough enemy on the other side of it. "I need to think," I told myself, forcing down my own rising panic as guards continued their frantic, useless attempts to breach the barrier. "There has to be another way in." My mind raced back through weeks of maintenance work, mental blueprints of the ship's systems assembling themselves in my thoughts with an urgency I had never felt before. The medical bay had multiple access points, not just the main doors currently sealed against us. Ventilation shafts, emergency maintenance conduits, systems that a senior Vral noble might not think to consider, because such things fell so far beneath his notice that he had likely never bothered to learn how they worked. But I had. "Your Majesty," I said, pushing forward through the crowd of guards until I stood close enough to be heard clearly. "There is another way in. But I will need help, and I will need it right now." The Queen turned toward me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something raw and desperate breaking through the careful control she had maintained even in her earlier fury. For the first time since this crisis began, she looked less like an empress ruling over 100 worlds and more simply like a mother who understood, with terrible clarity, that her daughter's life might be measured now in minutes rather than hours. "Show me," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. I led the way toward a service corridor 30 meters down the hall, a narrow passage most of the ship's residents never had reason to notice, let alone use. Peter fell into step beside me without needing to be asked, and together we worked to pry open an access panel that led into the ship's maintenance conduits, a network of crawl spaces designed for engineers rather than emperors, built for function rather than grandeur. "This will take us behind the medical bay's primary systems," I explained as we worked, my hands moving quickly over familiar mechanisms while guards and healers watched with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "There is a secondary access point near the emergency power relay that was never designed to be sealed the same way as the main entrance, because it needs to remain accessible during system failures." The Queen did not hesitate. She moved into the narrow conduit behind me with a grace that seemed almost unnatural for a space built for maintenance workers rather than royalty, and I understood, watching her fold herself into that cramped, undignified space without a single word of complaint, exactly how much she loved her daughter. Peter and two of the smaller guards followed, while the rest remained behind, still working uselessly at the main doors, providing whatever distraction they could manage. The conduit was tight and poorly lit, filled with the low hum of machinery and the particular smell of recycled air that I had long since stopped noticing during my normal shifts. I moved quickly, counting junctions and turns from memory, grateful for once that my job had required me to learn every hidden corner of a ship. I had never expected to need this intimately. We reached the secondary access point after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, and I worked the release mechanism with hands that had finally begun to shake now that the adrenaline of the moment was catching up with me. The panel slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow gap behind one of the medical bay's support structures, close enough to the main chamber that I could hear voices on the other side. One of those voices belonged to Lord Vesic. I could not understand the words, but I recognized the tone, calm and measured in a way that felt deeply, profoundly wrong given the circumstances. This was not the voice of a desperate man cornered by his own crimes. This was the voice of someone who believed, entirely, that he remained in complete control of everything unfolding around him. The Queen pressed close beside me, peering through the gap with an intensity that radiated off her like heat. I watched her jaw clench, watched her hands curl into fists once more, and understood that whatever restraint she had shown until now was very nearly exhausted. "We need a plan," I whispered, as quietly as I could manage. "If we simply burst through, he may do something irreversible before we can stop him." The Queen's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and calculating despite the raw fear still visible beneath the surface of her composure. "You have gotten us this far, human. What do you suggest?" I thought quickly, drawing on the only advantage I truly possessed in this entire situation, an advantage that had nothing to do with strength or status or ancient bloodlines, and everything to do with simply understanding the machines around me better than anyone else present. "The containment chamber Ithnara is resting in runs on the same emergency power relay as this maintenance conduit," I said. "If Lord Vesic intends to tamper with it, he will need to access its primary controls directly. But there is a manual override just behind this wall, one that could lock him out of the chamber's systems entirely, buying us the time we need to reach him safely." "Do it," the Queen said immediately, without a moment's hesitation. I moved to the panel I had identified, my fingers finding familiar switches and controls despite the poor lighting, and began working through the override sequence as quickly as I dared, aware that any mistake here could cost us everything. On the other side of the wall, I heard Lord Vesic's voice shift, a note of surprise entering his previously calm tone as something in his controls clearly stopped responding the way he expected. I worked faster, sweat beading on my forehead despite the conduit's cool recycled air, and felt a surge of fierce satisfaction as the override finally locked into place, with a soft, confirming click. The Queen did not wait for further confirmation. She moved past me with startling speed, guards and Peter and myself following as quickly as we could manage, bursting through the narrow gap and into the medical bay's main chamber in a rush of motion that caught Lord Vesic entirely by surprise. He spun toward us, his composed expression cracking for the first time since this entire crisis had begun, and I saw, in that brief unguarded moment, the calculating mind of a man who had planned meticulously for every scenario except the one where his target found an entrance he had never considered. Guards moved quickly to restrain him, and though he offered no violent resistance, I watched him straighten his robes with a strange, almost theatrical calm, as though even capture were simply another step in a plan he still believed he controlled. The Queen ignored him entirely, rushing instead to her daughter's containment chamber, her hands pressed against the transparent barrier as she searched Ithnara's still form for any sign that we had arrived in time. "She is stable," one of the healers reported after a tense moment of checking readouts, relief evident in her voice. Whatever he intended to do, we stopped it before it could take effect. The Queen's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it seemed to physically diminish her, if only for a moment, before she straightened again and turned toward Lord Vesic with an expression that made even the guards holding him take an involuntary step back. "You would have taken her from me," she said, her voice quiet in a way that felt far more dangerous than any shout. Lord Vesic met her gaze without flinching, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the desperation I might have expected from a man caught so thoroughly in his own scheme. "I would have secured this empire's future, Your Majesty. The princess is soft. She spends her hours with servants and outsiders, wasting her potential on idle curiosity rather than preparing herself for the weight of the crown she will one day carry. I did what generations of advisors before me lacked the courage to do." I felt a surge of anger at his words, thinking of every conversation Ithnara and I had shared, every genuine question she had asked about humanity, not out of idle amusement, but out of real, thoughtful curiosity about a species entirely new to her experience. Whatever softness Lord Vesic believed he had seen in her, I had witnessed something different entirely, a mind curious enough and open enough to reach across the vast differences between our species and find something worth understanding. The Queen apparently saw the same thing I did, because her expression, when she responded, carried a certainty that silenced whatever justification Lord Vesic might have continued to offer. "My daughter's curiosity is not weakness. It is the very quality that led her to befriend a species you dismissed as insignificant, a species whose engineer uncovered your entire scheme while your own systems, the ones you trusted so completely, noticed nothing at all. If there is softness in this room, Lord Vesic, I do not believe it belongs to her." He had no response to that, and the guards led him away in silence, his careful composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of a plan that had ultimately failed against the very quality he had underestimated most. I stood near the containment chamber for a long moment afterward, watching the healers work to stabilize Ithnara's condition now that the immediate threat had passed, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with me all at once. Peter stood beside me, quiet and thoughtful, both of us processing everything that had happened in the span of what felt like only a few hours, but had somehow reshaped both our lives entirely. The Queen approached us slowly, and I straightened instinctively, uncertain what to expect after everything we had just witnessed together. She stopped before us, and then, to the visible shock of every guard and healer still present in the room, she lowered herself into a formal bow, a gesture I later learned no Vral monarch had extended to anyone outside their own royal bloodline in recorded memory. "I nearly executed an innocent man today," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine with an honesty that felt more vulnerable than anything I had witnessed from her since the crisis began. "I let my fear and my fury nearly cost the life of someone who had done nothing wrong, simply because it was easier than facing the truth that the danger to my daughter came from within my own trusted circle. You stopped me from that mistake, and then you found a way to save her life when even my own guards could not reach her in time." I did not know what to say, standing there in a medical bay surrounded by alien technology, facing a monarch who ruled over more worlds than I could properly count, while she offered me a gesture of respect that clearly went against everything her position and her culture typically demanded. "I only did what felt right, Your Majesty," I finally managed. "Peter is my friend, and Ithnara has always treated me with kindness I did not expect to find so far from home. I could not simply watch either of them come to harm without trying to help." The Queen straightened, studying me with an expression that had shifted entirely from the fury and grief of earlier hours into something quieter and more contemplative. "Humanity is new to this coalition," she said, loud enough that everyone present could hear her clearly. "Many among the older empires believe your species offers little of value beyond curiosity, a strange, fragile people who arrive too late and too weak to matter much in the larger balance of power. I confess I have shared some measure of that assumption myself, in quieter moments I am not proud of." She paused, glancing back toward her daughter's chamber before continuing. "But you have shown me today that value is not always measured in strength or in the age of one's civilization. It can be measured in loyalty, in careful attention to details others overlook, in the simple, stubborn courage to speak truth to power even when every instinct warns against it. These are not small qualities, Daniel Ashworth. I do not believe I will forget what you have done here today, and I do not believe my empire should forget it either." Word of what happened aboard the Caliph Ascendant spread quickly through the coalition in the days that followed, carried by diplomats eager to share a story that reflected so poorly on one empire's internal politics and so favorably on humanity's unexpected role in preventing a tragedy. I found myself, in the weeks after, treated with a new kind of respect by delegates who had previously looked past me entirely, though I suspected the deeper shift in how humanity was regarded would take much longer to fully settle into place across a coalition built on centuries of established hierarchy. Peter returned to his quiet maintenance work, though he told me privately, more than once, that he thought about that corridor and those guards holding his arms more often than he cared to admit. I understood the feeling well, because I found myself thinking about it too, about how close an entirely innocent man had come to paying for a crime he had never committed, simply because it would have been convenient for everyone else involved. Ithnara recovered fully over the following weeks, and the first thing she did upon regaining enough strength to walk unassisted was seek me out in the maintenance bay, appearing in the doorway with a healer trailing anxiously behind her, insisting she needed rest rather than visits. She looked tired still, thinner than I remembered, but her eyes held the same bright curiosity that had first drawn her to ask why humans kept photographs of the people we loved. "I heard you saved my life," she said, settling carefully onto a nearby workbench despite the healer's obvious disapproval. "I had some help," I admitted, thinking of Peter and the Queen and every strange, terrifying step that had led us to that hidden conduit behind the medical bay. Ithnara was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression more serious than I had ever seen from her before. "My mother told me what you said, about my curiosity not being a weakness. I have spent my whole life hearing the opposite from nearly everyone around me. It is strange, hearing it argued so fiercely by someone who has known me only a few months, when my own counsel could not be bothered to argue it after knowing me my entire life." I thought carefully about my answer, aware that this conversation mattered more than most I had ever had in my life. "Maybe it takes someone from outside a system to see its blind spots clearly," I said. "Humans are new here. We do not carry the weight of centuries of assumptions about how things are supposed to be done. Sometimes that makes us look foolish, but sometimes, I think, it lets us notice things everyone else has simply stopped looking at." She smiled at that, a genuine, warm expression that reminded me exactly why I had risked everything to make sure she survived long enough to smile again. "Whatever assumptions your empire held about humanity before that day faded gradually into something more complicated, more respectful, over the months that followed. I remained aboard the Caliph Ascendant a while longer, no longer simply a maintenance engineer overlooked by the crowds around him, but someone whose name carried a particular weight in certain circles, someone the Queen herself acknowledged whenever our paths happened to cross. I never sought that recognition. I had only wanted to stop an injustice I could not walk past, to protect a friend who did not deserve to die for a crime he never committed, and to honor a friendship with a young princess who had shown me more genuine curiosity and kindness than most of my own species had managed in far longer acquaintances. But recognition found me anyway, carried on the strength of a single question that had echoed through that corridor on the worst day of the Queen's life. A question I had answered not with power or status, but with nothing more than evidence, honesty, and the simple, stubborn refusal to let an innocent man pay for a crime he did not commit. "Who dared to harm my daughter?" the queen had roared that day, her fury shaking the very walls around us. And in the end, it was not a warrior, or a diplomat, or a powerful noble who answered that question and set things right. It was simply a human engineer, doing what humans have always done best when everything around them seems impossibly large and impossibly dangerous. He stepped forward anyway,